I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm going to say a word about the European digital policy. And I would like to say in which regulatory context the European regulation of IA fits, and the future standard contained in the IA Act are part of a more general political and legal strategy. And because there is a particular context in Europe, we have not a European digital platform. We need to regulate our internal market, and there is some condition for exercising the European competence. So all that explains the European digital policy. So I will first to say a few words about this European context, the European legal framework for the digital regulation. And then I will present the legislative choices made in the IA Act, why regulation based on a risk-based approach, what were the other possible choices, and what are the consequences of these choices. Well, basically,
thanks so much. We have on Zoom Marussia Levesque, who is an associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, and she has had a career in policy. She was part of the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, dealing with digital policy and AI in a very, like in 2019, which sounds like yesterday, but at the same time, it was when these issues and policy matters were not definitely on the radar for governments. And she would talk a bit about the situation in Canada and the US, but she can tell us herself. Thanks so much.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I'll keep this short. From a descriptive standpoint, I'll make the argument that both Canada and the US prioritize a risk-based approach to AI regulation. Then I'll unpack what this notion of risk-based regulation means. And I'll propose that the opposition between a risk-based and a precautionary approach is perhaps overblown. They're more like close siblings than distant cousins. And then I'll suggest that the criticism that is often directed at the risk-based approach is better directed at the underlying cost-benefit analysis that undergirds the risk-based approach. And the core issue is whether we should tolerate some harm in the name of innovation. Thank you.
And finally, we have Barry Wang here with us. Barry is a member of the center at the University of Sydney. He joined recently, and he has a dual background in law and computer science, which makes him kind of the perfect candidate for the center. But he also brings his expertise of having worked with companies in the development of AI solutions in-house. So Barry, up to you.
Yeah, my name is Barry. I'm a research officer at the University of Sydney. And as part of my research work this year, I've been looking into the different approaches to regulating AI in China and how they've been thinking about AI-related issues. And in my presentation, I'll just be providing a snapshot of what's going on in China right now, because in the past 2 years, there has been quite a lot happening, and just trying to help everyone make sense and map out what's happening in China.
So Brunessen, if you want to take the long term. And as you will see, we'll go from the EU to the US and Canada, and then China, and then at the end, we'll try to bring it together to try to answer the question that Karen was giving us in the keynote yesterday, which is, so if the idea of the EU regulating is a good idea, but what are the options for Australia to do it on the basis of what other countries are doing? So he will start with a presentation on the EU. The slides, yeah. Send them yesterday to Nick. Okay. Sorry, that we did not anticipate that. Okay. You don't have the, okay.
Okay.
That is about. Maybe we change the order and we start with Marussia then while we solve the slides. Marussia, is too much putting you on the spot to get you to start?
Not at all. Happy to break the ice. Okay, so I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Do let me know if that's an issue, but if I don't hear from you, I'll just proceed. So let's talk about risk-based AI regulation in Canada and the US. So just to provide you an overview of where I'm going today, I'll describe the Canadian and US approaches to show that they're both driven by a risk-based approach to AI regulation. And then I'll unpack the stakes of risk-based regulation a little bit more. So let's start with the US. Now, what we don't have is comprehensive federal AI regulation. We have some activity on specific types of AI systems, for instance, biometric recognition, where there's a mosaic of state and local regulation. For instance, California and Massachusetts regulate biometric surveillance. Illinois regulates the use of AI-driven video analysis in job interviews. But those are very kind of specific issues that are subject to regulation. We remain with a really fragmented legal landscape. And self-regulation somewhat fills these gaps. For instance, there's a voluntary moratorium by big tech on providing facial recognition capabilities to law enforcement. Microsoft also dropped contested emotion recognition capabilities from its products. But these are very kind of surgical interventions that really fall short of a comprehensive cross-sectoral AI regulation. So we don't have that in the US. But what we do have are some pretty consistent signals promoting risk-based regulation. So the White House started thinking about AI regulation back in 2016, and one of those reports, Preparing for the Future of AI, really highlighted the importance of adopting a risk-based approach to AI regulation. And that's sort of a common and continuing thread. In 2020, the White House released a second guidance for regulation of AI intelligence applications that was open for comments. And again, it highlights the importance of a risk-based approach. So what you end up with is a kind of tiered approach that is not unlike the EU's AI Act, which I'm sure we will hear more about in a few minutes. So this tiered approach is essentially one where the degree of risk determines the intensity of the regulatory intervention. So low-risk systems call for light touch interventions through things like mandatory disclosures. And by contrast, high-risk systems may require much more robust regulatory interventions, for instance, imposing obligations of redundant systems should AI systems fail, or remedies for errors and failures. So the guidance is a blueprint for modulating the intensity of regulation according to the risk level. In parallel, we have legislation to coordinate federal agencies and resources across the entire federal government to accelerate AI research and application in support of economic prosperity and national security. Those are the stated goals of the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative of 2021. Now, this is a really long and comprehensive act, but I want to highlight that it gives the mandate to the National Institute of Standards and Technology to develop a voluntary risk management framework. So again, regulatory intervention is framed in terms of risks. So that's what we have. Now, what could we get? Well, there's a couple of bills on the horizon. Some are specific to particular AI technologies, including biometric recognition. Others are more process-oriented. And within that second category, I want to bring to your attention the Algorithmic Accountability Act, whereby large companies should perform, or must rather perform, participatory and ongoing risk impact assessments. Specifically, they must perform ongoing testing and evaluation of privacy risks. So the spirit of this bill is really that sunlight is the best disinfectant, in the sense that it forces transparency onto these large companies to be more reflective of the kind of risk that their activities entail. So this, in a nutshell, is a very incomplete and succinct summary of some of the regulatory activity in the US, to highlight that one common thread running across these initiatives is a risk-based approach. Now, let me turn to Canada briefly. So there are two prongs to AI regulation in Canada. One set of rules applies to the public sector, and the other set of rules applies to the private sector. The commonality between both, unsurprisingly, is that they adopt an approach that is based on impacts, which for our purposes, I'm using interchangeably with a risk-based approach, and I'll explain a bit why later. So let me turn to federal regulation of the public sector use of AI systems. So there's a directive in place on automated decision-making. It's been in effect since 2020, and it regulates the deployment of AI systems in the federal public administration. So it applies to public-facing services, for example, recommendations or decisions about the eligibility of people for public benefits, or granting immigration visas, for instance. So for full disclosure, I was part of the initial group of people looking at this. I had a very small role to play, but I did want to flag it in the interest of full disclosure, as I'm somewhat biased. So the directive requires public agencies that are looking to deploy AI systems to undergo a prior algorithmic impact assessment to determine the risk level. So this impact assessment is a questionnaire, about 80 questions, to evaluate the risk inherent to the proposed deployment. The questionnaire has attracted some criticism, with scholars pointing out that some of the simplistic and binary questions are inappropriately distant from harms on the ground. Things like asking if the stakes of the decisions are very high are kind of abstract questions, where a public servant making these calls may not kind of keep an ear to the ground and be able to spot, articulate, anticipate how a system will really land in the impacted communities. At any rate, the outcome of the questionnaire is a classification in one of 4 risk categories, which are meant to convey the intensity, reversibility, and duration of the impact. And the higher the level, the more requirements apply. So if I take the last one, level 4, one would need to undergo prior peer review, notify users that an AI system is involved, describe its training data, have a human in the loop so decisions are fully automated, and importantly, include a meaningful explanation for an adverse decision. So for instance, a decision that uses an AI system to deny a benefit or service. So that's for the public sector. Moving on to the private sector, we have a new bill in town, brand new from June 2022. It's a first pass. It's going to go through more parliamentary debate and hopefully public consultations. The important point I want to highlight is that it is an embodiment of a risk-based approach, insofar as you can sort of draw low impact systems, which are subject to kind of minimal obligations, and high impact systems, which are subject to more demanding obligations, including the ones you see on the screen, hopefully. So things like mandatory harm and bias risk assessment, transparency obligations, so a public description of the system, both from the manufacturer of the system and the entity using it. So again, there's some links to be made with the EU proposed AI Act, where the providers of the users of the system also have different transparency obligations. And lastly, these higher impact systems, should they incur serious harm, that harm has to be reported to public authorities. So a lot of the obligations in the Act hinge on this high impact classification. So this is another way to say this is a risk-based approach. Now, this isn't the focus of today's presentation, and in the interest of time, I'll just briefly say that one of the issues with the bill as it stands is that a lot of the actual substance of the law are yet undefined. They are delegated to rulemaking. And that is not very different from some of the issues that people have with technical standards being kind of the last mile implementation of AI regulation in other contexts. So in the AI bill in Canada, the government will basically get to define what is high impact. And that is sort of the core element of the law, because it's like the door that one has to pass through in order to be subject to the really stringent obligations that I've just mentioned earlier. So just to do a quick recap, the US consistently champions a risk-based approach to AI regulation. It has emitted these signals in sort of policy guidance document. The new Algorithmic Accountability Act is also an embodiment of that insofar as it imposes a privacy risk assessment. And that's just the latest development in this trajectory. As for Canada, the public sector already implements a risk-based approach with this kind of 4-tiered risk levels for using AI in the federal service. And the proposed bill that would apply to the private sector also has this philosophy through higher obligations for high impact systems. So with this in mind, I want to unpack a little bit what it means to engage in risk-based regulation. And if somebody wants to give me a pointer on time, I think I have about 5 minutes left, but I'm happy to go a little bit faster since I know we're started. Perfect, thank you. Great. So what do we mean when we talk about risk-based regulation? Well, it's about modulating the intensity and the modality of regulatory intervention according to the risk level. So on screen, you see one framework here by Black and Murray, offering one avenue to adapt regulation to the type of risk that you have. So we won't go through all of them, but just to take the last one at the bottom row, systemic non-compensable risk. Well, this would mean highly restrictive ex-ante regulation on the development and the deployment of some technology, as well as trialing. So think about GMOs, stem cell research, aviation, nuclear power. So these would be pretty restrictive regulatory approaches, if you will. And against this backdrop, I want to just kind of pause and say that there's a narrative that pits risk-based regulation as opposed to a precautionary approach, as if they were completely different. And I want to push back against that a little bit. First, I'll define what a precautionary approach is. So when there is uncertainty about the risks of serious or irreversible harm, the onus is on the proponent of a technology to prove its safety. So this comes to us through the environmental law space, and it could be more robust as a principle rather than a soft approach. But the points that remain is you're looking at uncertainty about risks to make a decision about whether to shift the onus on the proponent of the technology to prove that it's safe. And the US has explicitly rejected the precautionary approach in its stance on AI regulation, saying that it imposes an impossibly high standard that society, such that society will be prevented from enjoying the benefits of AI. And I want to push back against that because I think it conflates the precautionary approach with an absolute ban. So this is not what we're talking about with a precautionary approach. Rather, it just says, slow down, you need to positively prove safety. So it's about imposing more ex-ante safeguards, but it's not necessarily red lines like we see in the AI Act, with a ban on remote biometric identification by law enforcement in some contexts. Moreover, the precautionary approach still uses risk as a core criteria. So at a very high level, it is a risk-based approach. The way to decide whether or not to apply it is if there's uncertainty about the risk of serious and irreversible harm, as you see underlined here in the last row. So I think that we can combine the kind of traditional way of thinking about risk-based frameworks and the precautionary approach under one umbrella, because they're just looking at risk from a different lens. In the context of the precautionary approach, you're focusing on whether there's a serious or irreversible harm, whereas if you're looking at kind of the traditional risk-based framework, it's more about whether the harm is individual or systemic, or if it's compensable or not. So this is my argument that they're more like close siblings than distant cousins. They may fight, but ultimately they're still in the same family. So I'm going to close with this question I want to leave you with, which pertains to the cost-benefit analysis underlying the debate about risk-based regulation. If we zoom out one level, risks are just part of the cost in the cost-benefit analysis. The real issue is the legitimacy of pitting costs against benefits, mostly when the benefits are economic and the costs come to individual rights or environmental risks and so on. So the real question becomes, are there risks not worth taking? Are there unacceptable costs, even in the light of tremendous economic benefits? And this echoes a common civil society criticism that a risk-based approach is really incompatible with a rights-based approach. What I think they're saying is, you cannot take any risks with regards to right. Ultimately, a cost-benefit analysis that dilutes rights as the cost of doing business is incompatible with this categorical conception of rights. You cannot take risks when it comes to violating rights just a little for innovation's sakes, because rights are non-negotiable. They cannot be weighted against other interests like industry growth. Last point, equities. Let's think about who bears the brunt of the cost and who bears the benefits. So I've been a little bit critical of the US stance, so I'll try to balance it out by pointing out that the draft guidance of 2020 on AI regulation invites regulators to consider precisely this, to consider the distributional effects of AI regulation. And that is consistent with asking who bears the cost and who reaps the benefits. Given the crucial propensity to experiment some AI systems on vulnerable populations, undocumented migrants, low-skilled workers, incarcerated people, etc., it's really crucial to think about who is going to be bearing the cost of innovation. Even if there's a net benefit overall, if it's always the same subpopulation that bears cost, this should give us some pause. So with this, I will pause myself and hand it over to José-Miguel. If you have questions, comments, this is my information. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thanks so much. I cannot agree more with everything you said, except for the transparency being the best disinfectant. As someone who has researched corruption, it is a disinfectant that works if you don't have anything else, but there are much better ones. So Brandeis was not right about that. So now we go back to the room to Brunessen.
The European Union, it's now leading a global digital policy. So there is a data governance, trust, IA, regulation of platform, digital services, digital market, cybersecurity. All these areas are linked. The goal of trusted IA must be achieved through several texts, not just the IA Act. So the European objective is to find a balance between two requirements. First, ensure that the IA system placed in the European market are safe and respect fundamental rights. And the second point is facilitate the development of a European single market for IA and prevent the fragmentation of the European market. So the IA Act, the European IA Act, is a complement of other regulation, especially on data regulation. So data governance is an essential prerequisite for IA regulation in Europe. The main idea is to regulate the design of IA system upstream to enable widespread use. So the consumer must have confidence in these systems to use them. But it's not. Okay. No, it changed alone. So, obviously, innovation should not be limited too much either, even in Europe. So Europe finds a balance around these 2 points, 2 aspects. On one hand, organizing access to quality and reliable data to enable development of secure IA system. And in the other end, regulating IA systems that present risk of bias and discrimination. And I will mention these 2 points in turn. First, the text upstreams the IA Act that frames the data governance, and then the risk-based approach of the European IA Act. So the first point, upstream the IA Act, the European data regulation. European policy is beginning to take shape for the opening and the circulation of data. Economically, the data is non-rival good, so it means the economic value of data becomes exponential the more it is crossed with other data sets. Moreover, it is not always those who hold the data who are able to extract the value from it. So the European political objective is therefore to circulate data to ensure that they are shared. So for the European Union, the challenge is to open and organize the sharing of different data sets. This access to data shows a complementarity between the IA regulation and other European regulation adopted in the digital field. The idea is the same. Trusted IA is based on quality data. So promoting trusted IA is fully linked to the Data Governance Act and to the open data policy. The goal is to establish trust mechanism for reuse, sharing, and pooling of high-quality data. The European Union is aware that we have been left behind the capture of personal data by a digital platform, foreign digital platform. We were able to limit the scope of the problem with GDPR, but the personal data battle is lost for Europe. So the European legislator is therefore now focusing its effort on non-personal data, public data, industrial data, etc. The bet is that this kind of data, non-personal data, will be more important for the development of the IA than personal data. The market regulation and also involve policy competition policy. The objective here is limit the massive capture of data on their exclusive exploitation by digital platform. So this objective is embodied in two texts. The P2B regulation initiated data regulation of digital platform. No, it's not. It's this one. And the famous DMA, the Digital Markets Act, which includes provision on data governance too. So the idea is gatekeepers benefit from access to large amount of data that they collect when providing digital services. And the DMA organize effective and immediate access to data generated when using digital platform to prevent gatekeepers from limiting industry innovation. For the development of high-risk IA system, this text tries to make high-quality datasets available. In addition, European Union wants to create European common data space to facilitate this data sharing. The challenge here is the same, is to enable reliable, accountable, and non-discriminatory access to high-quality data for training, validating, and testing IA system. For example, at the moment, European Union is setting up an European health data space. My second point is the European approach, the regulation modulated by the risk. In this context, the European Union proposed a general approach to IA. The choice is a general approach and not a sectorial one. However, this regulation is asymmetric. It does not concern all the IA systems. It is a graded approach according to risk. IA applications are classified according to their level of risk. So there were other regulation choice possible. The first would have been to adopt an ad hoc sector by sector approach. This kind of sectorial logic would have consisted, for example, in differentiating the regulation of IA according to whether it is applied to health issue, to student grading, to the evaluation of a person's ability to repair a bank loan, for example. A sectorial regulation would have consist in considering, for example, that medical matter are by definition important risk, except that a more refined approach has been favored. We can consider that managing a hospital appointment system in an automated way does not have the same impact as using IA for diagnostic or decision support. So this siloed, this sector-based logic has been discarded in favor of a risk-based approach. You tell me when, because I'm fully lost in time this morning. So
you have at least another 5 minutes.
Okay. Certainly, there is some specific rules for IA in other European texts for autonomous scores or for aviation, for example. But essentially, the idea is to have a general approach covering whole area. I would like to point out that there is an exception for military field, which is not governed by the text. Another legislative choice would have been to set mandatory requirements for all the IA system So regardless of the level of risk they present, each normative option was assessed for economic and social impact, and the preferred option is regulate the IA risk system only. The challenge here of this risk-based approach was to reach the best conciliation between respect for fundamental rights on IA security on one hand, and limiting compliance costs on the other. So the risk assessment must distinguish IA system between uses of IA that create unacceptable risk, high risk, and low or minimal risk. So there is a, well, so it's maybe too much, but European texts are very strong. So there is a prohibition of a certain practice. For example, I don't tell everything. The kind of practice prohibited is, for example, IA system that exploit vulnerabilities due to the age or physical or mental disability of a group of people. And IA Act also prohibits IA social scoring by public authorities only. And finally, the use of real-time remote biometric identification system in public area for law enforcement purpose is in principle prohibited. In principle, because there are many exceptions. For example, if it's necessary to search certain victim of crime, such as missing children, or for prevention of terrorist attack. For IA risk systems, there is specific requirement. The IA risk are those that present significant risk to the health, safety, or fundamental rights of people. The classification of an IA system as a high risk is based on the purpose of the IA system. So we have two broad categories of high risk IA system. The first one is IA system intent for use as a safety component of product. IA system used for machine or medical devices, for example. And the second category is autonomous IA systems that raise questions about respect for fundamental rights. And there is a list which may change. So the list is substantial. For any example, management of critical infrastructure, road traffic, electricity, etc. Education, for example, IA system intended to be used to determine access to educational institution or to evaluate students, access to public services and social benefits, law enforcement authorities, migration, asylum, and border control management. And last one, administration of justice and democratic processes. So I want just to highlight if I have 2 minutes. There is some doubt have been raised about the appropriateness of an exhaustive list of IA risk systems that exclude certain use deemed risky, such as insurance premium determination. And it was also pointed out that this list did not take sufficient account of more general or collective risk, risk to a group of individuals, or risk for society as a whole. The text sets requirements for IA risk IA system with respect to data governance, documentation and record keeping, transparency and human control, robustness, accuracy, security, etc. There is a minimum requirement, so there is a significant flexibility. IA system providers can, in some way, choose how to apply, how to comply with this requirement. There is also specific rules, transparency rule for IA system intended to interact with physical people, to emotion recognition and biometric categorization system, and to IA system used to generate or manipulate image or audio or video content, the deepfake. And the last, the last category, it's for low or minimal risk IAs. There will essentially be self-regulated through code of conduct. So I'm stop here. Sorry for my English, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much. It was great because it was also the first part was, I think, very important because when we look at the regulation in the EU, we tend to forget that data, quality data, which is non-personal data. We are always looking at the GDPR, and we forget all these new rules that are coming to make all the type of data available and what they can do with it, and the quality data as part of the regulation of AI. So Barry, as he goes. The thing with modern academics that they just have a phone instead of a paper or computer.
Definitely. All right, so today I'm going to talk about talk through some of the approaches to AI regulation in China. And there's so much happening, and I just want to provide a high-level overview for everyone so that you can kind of make sense of what's happening in China. And I'll first start by giving some background on Chinese AI policy, because I think it's important to contextualize the recent regulatory developments with the policy in mind. So the most important policy document to be aware of is the New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan, the AIDP, issued in 2017 by the State Council, which is the chief administrative body in China. And prior to this document, AI policy was scattered and treated as one of many technologies. And this was the first document where AI was treated as its own technology vertical and kind of has a centralized planning around artificial intelligence. And the AIDP can be split into the strategic objectives of the AIDP can be split into 3 dimensions: geopolitical, fiscal, and legal and ethical. And it sets out 3 key timeframes to achieve certain goals. And I know the text is a bit small, but essentially by 2030, China wants to be the world innovation center for artificial intelligence. At a fiscal level, China wants a domestic core AI industry to be worth 1 trillion yuan. And in terms of legal and ethical, they want to refine and complete laws and standards relating to emerging technology. So in terms of the implementation of the AIDP, there's often a misunderstanding that the implementation will be centrally enacted, but in reality, the implementation of the strategic objectives happens at the local, happens through collaboration with private companies and local governments. And in this view, the AIDP can be viewed as a document which nudges and coordinates and also de-risk and actively incentivize local AI projects. And the way this is played out in China is through the establishment of AI pilot zones, which can be akin to a regulatory sandbox approach. And currently there are 17 AI development zones, each with their own specialization. For example, Shenzhen, which is the frontier city of development in China, their specialization is advanced research and development and the production cycle of artificial intelligence. Whereas cities like Hefei deals with speech recognition. And in addition to these AI pilot zones, there are also national champions, private companies, which have been tasked with specific applications. For example, Baidu, which has been tasked with autonomous driving. And through this approach, there is a sentiment that AI is a rapidly changing technology and that to achieve the strategic objectives of the AIDP, there needs to be a process of iteration, experimentation, and to echo a famous Chinese saying, it's very much similar to the process of crossing a river by filling the stones. So moving on to the AI regulatory environment, I think the best way to make sense of what's happening in China in terms of regulation is through the different branches of the Chinese bureaucracy and often competing bureaucracy and what initiatives they are focused on. So first we have the Cyberspace Administration of China. They are the internet regulator and censor of China, and they have quite a high level of maturity in their work, and they're mainly focused on rules for online algorithm, with a focus on public opinion. And next we have the China Academy of Information and Communication Technology. They're an influential scientific research institution under the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And they've been really focused on developing tools and certifications around this concept of trustworthy AI, which is relevant to risk management. And next we have the Ministry of Science and Technology. And their main focus is on developing ethical norms and implementing these norms within company boards and institutions. And finally, we have the Standardization Administration of China, which is authorized by the State Council to complete the process of AI standardization. And the remaining of my presentation will be kind of based on the structure I've outlined here. So regulation of online algorithms. So there has been quite significant developments in this space in China. And the most important act to highlight is the Internet Information Service Algorithm Recommendation Management Provisions. Like all of the acts are quite long, so I'll just call this the management provisions. And this has been issued by the Cyberspace Administration of China and is in force since March this year and does carry with it civil penalty provisions. So the management provision applies to Internet Information Services, which is quite a broad umbrella term that includes social media platforms, e-commerce, ride-hailing, and algorithm recommendation technology is defined as algorithms that push information to users and includes recommendation algorithms, search ranked style algorithms, personalization algorithms, etc. And the management provisions can be broken down into 4 sections. So the first section is the norms for internet information service providers. And these norms include requirements for service providers to constantly assess their model, ensure data quality, and optimize for fairness, optimize for transparency and accountability. The second chapter deals with protections of users. So in addition to general protections, the management provision highlights a few distinct categories, and this includes the elderly. And with the elderly, there is a focus on protecting them from scams. And then there's minors with a focus on mental health, and also gig economy workers, which are additional categories that have been highlighted in the management provisions. The third section deals with the supervision and management of internet services. And finally, section 4 deals with legal liabilities of violating the provisions. And I can go on and on about each of the specific articles, but for the purpose of this presentation and to offer some comparative insight, I just want to highlight 2 specific articles. So the first one is the first one is Article 6, which is essentially the primary norm for internet service providers. And I want to highlight as part of this norm, service providers are encouraged to vigorously disseminate positive energy, or 正能量. And I think this is a confusing concept when it's translated directly, because what does it mean, right? So I want to provide two stories that may give some insight. So the term was first used as a political slogan and first used by Xi Jinping in 2012. But the first story I want to highlight is the term has gained quite a lot of popularity as a hashtag on social media platforms. And recently, TikTok, or the Chinese version Douyin, has implemented a section for positive energy on its application. And the section originally started with quite a political tone, and there were party members posting in that section. But over time, it developed quite organically, and the content that started dominating this channel ranged from people with disabilities sharing their experiences, all the way to workers eating lunch with their dog, talking about their lives. So I think the way this term is used is quite flexible. And the second story I want to share is more of a personal one, but open to interpretation. But I was having dinner with my mom like a few months back, and then out of nowhere she uses a term 正能量, or positive energy, and I was researching this, so I was quite surprised. I was like, yeah, where like, what does this term mean? Where do you hear it from? And she just said that it's generally a good vibe, and I saw people using it online. So I hope that provides some insight into what this concept may be. And I found it quite interesting. So the second article I want to highlight is Article 23, because I think this is interesting from a comparative perspective, especially when we think about risk management and the way risk management categorizes how we manage AI systems. So this article essentially requires AI management systems to be graded and categorized based on public opinion properties and social mobilization capabilities, in addition to the scale of the users, the type of content. And this likely reflects the focus of the Cyberspace Administration of China and their emphasis on public opinion. But it's important to keep in mind that this only applies to online algorithms. So the other provision I want to highlight, and I think it's important to keep in mind when viewing the management provisions, is the content ecosystem provision, which was enacted in 2020. But within the provision, it also deals with algorithm recommendation technology, and specifically the type of content that's allowed to be promoted, resisted, prohibited in these algorithmic systems. And it does also carry legal liability in the form of suspension of service. So moving on to frameworks for trustworthy AI systems. So trustworthy AI systems have been largely championed by the CAICT, and it's essentially, the way they've conceptualized it is very similar to the US and EU, essentially trying to operationalize ethical governance principles through a risk management approach. And their formulation of trustworthiness divides trustworthy, focuses on the characteristics which make up trustworthiness. And in here you can see reliability, controllability, transparency and explainability, data protection, clear responsibility, diversity and tolerance are the characteristics that form trustworthiness in the opinion of the CAICT. And they've also, in their white paper, proposed a framework for AI, for trustworthy AI. And it's quite overwhelming, so I'll break it down. But it's a proposed framework because it's part of a white paper and there's no mandatory requirement to follow this framework or use this framework. So breaking down this framework, at the high level, we can see that the characteristics of trustworthiness are mapped, and the level below is technology, a trustworthy supporting technology, which are technologies to do with explainability, to do with privacy protection, and to do with the stability of algorithmic decision-making. And one level down, we have essentially the corporate practices that make up trustworthy systems. And the Chinese approach is very similar and takes a life cycle approach to trustworthy AI. And in addition to, a life cycle approach focused on the design, the testing, and the operation of AI systems, and what we can do to mitigate these characteristics of trustworthiness or improve them. And there's also a focus on corporate culture and management mechanisms. And finally, we have industry trustworthy practices, which can essentially be broken down into three components, which is standards, assessments, and guarantees. And by achieving those three, that makes up industry trustworthiness practices. So AI ethics principles, I think in the interest of time, I'll just touch on this real quick. So the governance principles have been, I'll just highlight a few points. I think the AI governance norms have been established in China through quite a multi-stakeholder process with a lot of input from the private sector and from academia in China. And the governance principles outlined in 2009 have since been formalized into the ethical norms, which is released in 2021. And the interesting thing about the ethical norms, apart from the basic norms outlined here, is that it divides ethical norms into 4 distinct categories. There are management norms, which are different to R&D norms, which are different to supply norms, and also use norms. And finally, I want to talk about AI standardization, because standardization will become, I think, will have a very important role in influencing the development of specific AI technology. And standardization in China has been carried out by the Standardization Administration. And under the guidelines, their objective by 2021 is to clarify the top level standards, and by 2023 to develop standards for core applications. And in the document, they've outlined a AI standards architecture, which is also quite overwhelming, but I'll read through what each of these are. So over here at the high level, on the left-hand side, we have what they call the foundational commodities. And these are essentially terminology, testing methods that can be applied to all the rest of the architecture. And then B is supporting technologies and products. C is foundational software and hardware platforms, including smart chips, cloud computing. D is key common technologies. And this is where machine learning knowledge graphs sit. And from B to D, this is essentially what makes AI work. So the hardware all the way to the software. And then E, we have key field technologies. So this is natural language processing. F is products and services. So smart robots, smart terminals, smart services. And then G is industry applications like smart manufacturing, autonomous vehicles. And D to G can be thought of as the products and services and the outputs of AI. And finally, we have H, which deals with security and ethics. So just some final observations on the standardization process that I just want to add is, in China, there are currently national reforms in standardization. China wants to shift towards a more liberal standardization policy, which has private sector input and government input, like a more equal distribution between private sector input and government input. And this will likely have a role to play in the AI standardization framework. And the other thing I'll just want to highlight when we can compare this to what is happening in the US and EU is that it seems that China's AI standards architecture is quite pragmatic and deals with the whole production cycle of artificial intelligence, as opposed just to being limited to the software aspect. And that's the end of my presentation. I hope there's some insight that has been.
Thank you very much. I suppose we always we have probably better access to materials from the US and the EU normally, so we tend to forget what is going on in China. And in terms of standardization, which I take the opportunity to note that we have a project in the Sydney node on a comparative process of standardization between US, EU, and China. So if anyone wants to participate, just let us know, definitely. And so we would tend to forget about China. So the work of Barry is extremely useful, and to be honest, something that I don't think the knowledge that he has in his hand these days is not, it becomes very handy, but it's all quite exceptional in the Australian context. So anyway, open the floor. We have 10 minutes. I know that we were meant to have half an hour, but to you, Henry, I don't know if we need to wait yet, so people on Zoom can. I would say avoid introductions in the benefit of time.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed that. And I felt like we got really deeper perspectives than we usually get on everything there, like the data governance background to AI and everything. But my question is actually for Barry. What I found fascinating in the Chinese regulatory context is the emphasis on well-being. So the first ethical principle is harmony and human friendliness. And then also the good vibes catchphrase that you were talking about. I can see, you know, on the one hand, it's easy to be very cynical about that and imagine sort of the most Orwellian version of that, of compliance and passivity and so on and so forth. But it does strike me that there's a total absence in the Western regulatory framework of an emphasis on human flourishing. Everything is about preventing harm. Do you think there's a way, do you think there's scope to do that in a way that's compatible with, you know, broadly liberal values to focus more in the regulation on promoting flourishing rather than only preventing harm?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there definitely has to be, right? But I think the Chinese, the reason why there is that focus in China is because they emphasize the impact of artificial intelligence on society, in addition to its economic impacts. And I think as the applications of artificial intelligence continue to develop, like we'll have a better idea of how it can impact society. And to do that, I think there needs to be emphasis on like the actual development of AI within industry and the education and training of AI and understanding just among society in general. I think that's an important policy aspect that's often not talked about when we think about risk-based regulation, is that broader education and training and surrounding policies.
Thanks very much. Barry's actually just touched a little bit on my question, but I'm really interested to hear what the rest of the panel say. So one of the problems that I've found in my line of research has been that certainly there's a lot of regulation guidelines and even risk matrices popping up for regulating AI. But one of the problems I've noticed is that the people who end up filling them out are often, and I mean this with all possible respect, engineers or programmers who have been designing the AI, but don't really have much experience in thinking about things ethically, especially on a social level. And I guess my question is, I mean, Barry, you're sort of talking about this broader education that needs to go on. And I guess my question is sort of speaks to that point about what can we do to help project managers, developers to sort of have the skills to be able to fill out. For instance, I know in the Canadian example, there's the 83 question sort of guidelines that people can go through. But again, I know that's very perplexing for people who aren't confident in their ethical thinking. So I guess, sorry, that was a lousy question, but are there better ways that we can, really help upskill or help practitioners to more carefully engage with some of these great regulatory systems popping up?
Mm-hmm. Marussia, perhaps? Do you want to take this one? Have you heard the question?
Sure. So I can take it from two different angles. One would be to actively involve people other than engineers in the definition of what is a high-risk system. So if I link it back to the Canadian context, right now it's up in the air, what will a high-impact system be? We know that the government will define that in regulations. So there's space to make sure that this is an interdisciplinary approach. The other kind of line of proposal is through technical standards. So who is going to be shaping these standards? Is it only going to be an industry-driven process? I'm thinking, for instance, about the AI Act process, where high-risk systems will be deemed in conformity with the Act's requirement if they conform to standards. So right now we have a request for standards, and they're supposed to be inclusive on paper. They're supposed to go through kind of multi-stakeholder consultations, but in practice, it takes significant amount of time and energy to remain invested in that process. So one way to go about doing that is to kind of change the structural incentives so that it's not just technically native people, that are sort of well-versed in that aspect that get to shape standards, but other people. And we can dream big and even think about kind of including people that have been impacted by AI systems in the future shaping of these standards. So I think there's still space to broaden who gets to make these decisions, and we have to act soon.
Thanks. If I will go to the chat, but I cannot access it from here. So if anyone has access to the chat, okay. So, a question. I have a question in the room. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm rubbish with technology. Even simple stuff. This relates to the earlier question, and the common framing of all of the talks was on this risk-based approach. And my question is, risk, if we use a colloquial understanding of bad stuff that we don't want to happen, I'm just interested in what the bad stuff is. So what kinds of risks are we talking about? So in the EU, it's quite explicit in the Act about safety and about fundamental rights. But I'm wondering, so for example, in the Chinese context, what the bad stuff is, and also in the US and Canadian context, how are those risks centrally framed? I'm really interested in that. Thank you.
I guess in the Chinese context, in one perspective, if you look at the management provisions, the risk or the harms is related to like public opinion, social mobilization. It's definitely one perspective. And then, but I think broadly speaking, in the literature that I've seen, there's this sentiment that right now China's focus is mainly on establishing the structures of governance and institution, and very much leaving the contents and the contents of the regulation to be kind of developed iteratively. And in saying that, and when relating it back to the harms, it's hard to talk about harms this broadly. I think when you look at specific applications, it's much easier to talk about these harms. So in terms of autonomous driving, like the harm is clearly safety. and then same with medicine. But in online algorithms, the harm is a bit vague, a bit more vague. And I think there's that sentiment in a lot of the provincial level commentary when you actually get into the implementation of a lot of these principles.
Marusia, if you want to do something briefly.
Sure. So just to give you kind of like the black letter answer in the Canadian context, if we're talking about public sector risks, we're talking about risks to individuals or communities, to their rights, that is specifically. So rights of individuals or communities, risk to the health or well-being of individuals or communities, economic interests of individuals, entities, or communities, and the ongoing sustainability of an ecosystem. So kind of like an environmental slant. So that's the kind of immediate answer to your question. The other aspect to that is the distance between risks to individual rights and harms. I think those are different concepts. And one of the challenges that we have is oftentimes we only look at the risk to individual rights. And that is a much narrower category than harms writ large. To give you one specific example, in terms of bias and discrimination, this often occurs at a group level where it is much harder to sort of pin down kind of like the different error rates throughout a subpopulation that don't necessarily affect just one person. So this is an example where you would want to take a broader approach that is looking at harms, not just individual rights, to really capture the full array of risks.
And given the time, I will need to close it here. I know there's more interesting continuing. But thank you very much for being here, and we know what the options are for Australia if they want to follow any patterns. Thanks.